There was a Tuesday in October when I sat alone in the infusion suite for the fourth time, and finally understood what the silence meant. Not the silence of the room, though that kind of silence has its own particular weight, the slow drip of the floor bag overhead, the antiseptic smell that clings to everything including your clothes when you go home at the end of the day, but the silence of my phone. No calls, no texts, no checking in on you messages, no voicemails, just the screen dark and still, face up on the armrest of the recliner where I'd placed it an hour earlier in case someone needed to reach me. Or in case, more precisely, someone thought to reach me. My name is Margot Elaine Voss. I was 34 years old when I was diagnosed with stage 2 Hodgkin's lymphoma, and for the 12 months that followed my diagnosis, my parents spent a combined total of $41,000 supporting my younger sister's relocation to Florence, Italy, her program tuition, her apartment deposit, her transatlantic flight, her first 4 months of living expenses, her Italian language immersion course, and the professional-grade camera equipment she said she needed to build a portfolio that could take her career seriously. They did not contribute a single dollar to my medical treatment costs. What I want you to understand before anything else, before the paperwork and the phone calls and the moment Dr. Reyes used those 2 words that I will keep in a separate permanent folder inside my memory for the rest of my life, is that I am not a person who catastrophizes. I am not someone who inflates small hurts into grand wounds for the pleasure of having a grievance. I am a person who kept spreadsheets of my medical expenses the way some people keep diaries. I am a person who, even in the worst weeks of chemotherapy, woke up at 6 in the morning, fed my cat, and documented every explanation of benefits my insurance company sent me, every line item charge, every copay I'd paid and every denial I'd appealed. I did this because I knew, somewhere below the conscious surface of things, that clarity would matter later. I just didn't know how much or in what direction. If you've ever had a family phrase, one of those smooth, worn sentences that gets passed around at every difficult moment like a worry stone people reach for without thinking, ours was this, we do what we have to do for the ones who need it most. My mother said it when my grandmother needed a hip replacement and they helped with her copay. My father said it when my cousin's transmission died on the interstate, and they wired him $800 before the tow truck had even arrived. My sister said it once about a stray cat she found shivering under a parking meter and took to an emergency vet on a Sunday, as though she'd invented the concept of necessity herself. I believed in that phrase. I grew up believing in it the way you believe in the rules of grammar, not because you chose to, but because the people around you used it so consistently and with such apparent sincerity that it became part of how meaning got made. It was the family's constitution in a single sentence. The statement of values that answered every question about who we were when it mattered. I understand now that a phrase can be sincere and also strategic simultaneously, that the people using it can believe in it completely, in the abstract, while the actual practice of it has already been quietly restructured around a preference they'd never name out loud. The first time I noticed something was wrong, it wasn't a dramatic moment. It wasn't a scene I could point to clearly and say, there, that's when I knew. It was a phone call in late September, 3 weeks after my diagnosis, when I mentioned to my mother, carefully, calmly, with the particular care I have always taken when asking for anything, that my out-of-pocket maximum was going to hit $6,000 by November, and that I was trying to figure out whether I needed to take on additional consulting projects or whether there was a medical hardship loan program worth exploring. There was a pause. Not the pause of someone thinking through a problem alongside you. The pause of someone who has already thought through a problem without you, arrived at a conclusion they aren't ready to announce, and is now deciding how to navigate the gap between what they've decided and what you're asking. We'll figure something out, my mother said. I wrote that phrase down in my notebook that night. We'll figure something out. Next to it I wrote the date, September 29th. I wasn't sure yet why I was writing it down. I think some part of me recognized it as a kind of weather pattern, the thing said before the silence. I should tell you who my sister is, because she matters to this story in a way that cannot be reduced to jealousy or rivalry, even though I know that's the first read some people will reach for. The easier read. The neater one. Her name is Petra. She is 3 years younger than me, which makes her 31, and she is genuinely talented. I want to be precise about this because accuracy matters more to me than the kind of self-serving narrative that makes everything clean. Petra has real artistic instincts. She could always see a frame the way other people can't. The light coming from an unexpected angle, the composition that makes a moment feel both accidental and inevitable, the emotional center of a scene that everyone else was walking past. When she photographs people, they look like themselves in a way that most portrait photographers can't achieve. She has a gift. She is also someone who has never, in her adult life, been told no by our parents. This is not a character judgment on her. It is a pattern I observed over 15 years, documented unconsciously through memory, and only assembled into a complete picture when I had the specific need for it. The summer she dropped out of her graphic design degree to pursue photography full-time, my parents paid 2 months of her rent while she transitioned into the new direction. When she left a relationship and said she needed a fresh start somewhere else, my father drove a moving truck 19 hours to help her get established in Portland. When Portland didn't work out and she wanted to try New York, they flew her home and helped her regroup financially for 4 months until she had a plan. The reasoning was the same. Petra needs this right now. Petra is at a critical inflection point. This particular support is the thing that will finally let Petra find her footing. I had watched this pattern without fully naming it, the way you watch weather without studying meteorology. You know what a storm looks like. You don't necessarily understand the atmospheric conditions that formed it, and you especially don't ask yourself why the storm always forms in the same direction. What I didn't understand yet, sitting in that infusion suite in October, was that my diagnosis had created a resource conflict in my family, a genuine finite resources conflict that my parents had already quietly resolved before I ever knew there was a decision being made. They had resolved it in Petra's favor, and they had done so not with malice, I think, but with the particular blindness of people who have always seen one child as someone to invest in and the other child as someone to trust. Trusting me, in their framework, meant leaving me alone with my competence. Trusting me meant assuming that my calm was a report on my actual condition, rather than a learned behavior I developed in a family where drama was Petra's register and steadiness was mine. If you've ever been the steadier sibling, the one who always handles things, the one people brag about rather than worry over, you know exactly the invisible tax that steadiness levies. Stay with me, because the way this particular tax came due is the part one still find difficult to say plainly. October was manageable, or I told myself it was manageable because I needed it to be. My treatment plan involved 6 cycles of ABVD chemotherapy, doxorubicin, bleomycin, vinblastine, dacarbazine, administered every 2 weeks at an outpatient infusion center, attached to the Cancer Institute where Dr. Reyes practiced. Each session took approximately 4 hours. I would drive myself in on the treatment days and drive myself home after, stopping at the pharmacy for the anti-nausea prescription they'd called in, and then spend roughly 36 hours in the particular purgatory of post-infusion recovery, where sleep was shallow and food had no appeal and the world had a slightly muted quality to it, as though someone had turned a dial on the color saturation of ordinary life. I worked remotely as a financial analyst for a mid-sized logistics company. I had short-term disability coverage through my employer that paid 60% of my base salary during medical leave. I had savings, not extravagant savings but careful savings, the kind built up over years of the precise, low-drama financial management that had always been the operating mode of my adult life. I had a cat named Biscuit and a 2-bedroom apartment and a set of routines that the treatment disrupted but did not destroy. I was not without resources. That is important to understand because my father would later say that his assumption was I had the situation mostly handled, and I wanted to be clear that this assumption was built on the observable surface of my situation, not on any thorough inquiry into the details. The copays were $60 per infusion visit. The anti-nausea medications my insurance initially denied, a coverage gap I spent 7 weeks fighting through their appeals process, ran to $340 per prescription out of pocket during that denial period, which overlapped with 2 full cycles. The blood work required every 2 weeks before each infusion was billed separately from the infusion center, under a different billing department, and processed on a different timeline. The CT scan at week 6 to check interim treatment response was $420 after insurance processing. There were 3 additional imaging studies Dr. Reyes ordered based on ambiguous readings in the lymph node chain, each billed separately. By the end of October, I had spent approximately $2,300 out of pocket, with 10 infusion cycles remaining. I called my mother on a Sunday afternoon. I remember it was Sunday because the light was doing what it does in late October, that particular amber quality that makes everything look like the establishing shot of a memory, and laid out the numbers plainly and without drama the way I would have presented a financial model in a client meeting. I wasn't asking for charity. I wasn't performing distress. I was treating it as a conversation between adults about a shared family situation that had financial dimensions worth discussing openly. The out-of-pocket maximum is $6,000, I told her. Once I hit that, everything above it should be fully covered by insurance. But between now and hitting that threshold, I'm managing a cash flow situation that I want to be transparent about. My mother listened. She said the right things. That's so hard, honey. We hate that you're going through this. You sound so strong. And then after a pause, she said they'd been dealing with some expenses of their own lately, that she and my father weren't sure what they could manage right now, but that they'd talk about it. I said okay. I wrote it down that night. The date, the substance of what was said, the word lately. November was when I first heard the word Florence. Petra had been in contact with a photography school in Italy, a small, well-regarded program based in the city center, 8 months in duration, with rotating visiting artist residencies and a capstone portfolio exhibition that had placed students with agencies and galleries in Europe and New York. She'd been researching it for months without mentioning it to me, apparently. She brought it to my parents during a Sunday dinner in early November that I wasn't present for, because Sunday dinners had become difficult to manage between fatigue cycles and the logistical reality that any social commitment needed to be scheduled around how I felt 48 hours post-infusion. I found out about Florence the way I found out about most things in my family, not directly, not in a conversation designed to include me, but through the ambient information that passes between people who love each other imprecisely. My mother mentioned it in passing during a phone call, with the light tone of someone who has already processed the news and is now sharing it as settled fact rather than current development. Oh, and Petra's been looking at this photography program in Florence. Isn't that exciting? The whole thing is quite prestigious from what she's told us. How long is the program? I asked. 8 months. It starts in January. January. 2 months away. 2 months from when I would be entering my 4th cycle of chemotherapy, roughly the midpoint of my treatment. How much does it cost? I asked because I am someone who asks. My mother paused, that particular pause again, the one I had already begun to recognize, and then said, the program itself is about 15,000 euros. Then there's housing and living costs which we're working through. It all adds up, but it's such an opportunity. 15,000 euros. At the exchange rate that November, approximately $16,000 for the program tuition alone, before housing, before flights, before the daily reality of living in a European city on a student's budget. That's a significant amount, I said carefully. Well, my mother said, and her voice had that particular brightness it gets when she has already made a decision and is now in the process of communicating it rather than discussing it. We do what we have to do for the ones who need it most. There it was, the family phrase, deployed in a conversation about my sister's photography school program in Italy, not about my chemotherapy. Deployed so naturally, so unconsciously, that I wonder still whether my mother hurt herself using it in that context, or whether it had become so reflexive that it arrived without her knowing where it was aimed. I stayed on the phone for several more minutes. I kept my voice even. I asked a few more questions about the program. I said it sounded wonderful. I hung up and sat in my apartment in the October light and looked at the wall for a while. Then I opened my notebook and wrote the phrase down again. I had already written it once on September 29th. Now I wrote it a second time on November 7th. And I wrote next to it, said about Petra's Florence program. I want to be careful here, in this part of the story, about what I can prove and what I only suspected at the time. That distinction matters to me, not for legal reasons but for accuracy reasons. I am not someone who exaggerates, and I will not start now. What I suspected in November, that my parents were actively in the process of making a significant financial commitment to Petra's ambitions at the same time that they had told me they couldn't help with my medical expenses, and that these two facts existed in a relationship that was not incidental. What I could not yet prove, the scale of their financial commitment to Petra, the source of the funds, or whether the decision to decline my request had been made in full awareness of what they were simultaneously doing. So I did what I always do when I face uncertainty about something that matters. I documented. I kept a running log in a password-protected notes file on my laptop, dated entries verbatim where I could recall it, paraphrased with a notation of my confidence level where I couldn't. Every time I mentioned a medical expense to my parents, I wrote down what I said and what they said back. Every time my sister's name came up in connection with money and plans, I wrote down how my parents talked about it, what words they used, what the emotional register was compared to how they talked about my situation. This is not paranoia. This is not the behavior of a person manufacturing a grievance. This is the practice of someone who has spent enough time navigating situations where subjective experience gets revised after the fact, where people say that's not how it happened or you're misremembering, to understand that documentation is the only thing that survives a disagreement with its integrity intact. By the end of November, my log had 16 entries. I had spent in that same period approximately $3,800 out of pocket on medical costs. December was the month the fatigue became architectural. This is the most precise description I found for it. Not tiredness in the way you're tired after a long day of physical work, but a restructuring of the relationship between your body and gravity. Everything requires more energy than physics should require. Lifting a glass of water. Standing in the shower for more than 4 minutes. Thinking through a paragraph of a financial report to its conclusion without losing the thread. The mind is present, but the body has deducted a significant portion of the resources the mind needs to do its work, and the negotiation between them is constant and exhausting in its own right. I submitted formal medical leave documentation to HR on December 3rd. My short-term disability coverage activated. I continued working reduced hours on the days I could manage it because the structure of work was oddly stabilizing, a way of keeping the days organized around something other than treatment schedules and fatigue cycles and the particular mental static that comes from waiting for results and counts and numbers that tell you whether the medicine is doing what it's supposed to do. On December 12th, I called my parents. Both of them. My father answered. My mother was on the same call. I told them, as specifically as I could and without any performance of distress, that I had hit my deductible and was tracking toward the out-of-pocket maximum, that I had approximately $2,300 remaining before I reached it, and that covering that amount was going to require me to liquidate a portion of my emergency fund at a time when I wanted to preserve those funds against the possibility of complications. I said, I want to ask directly if there's any way you can help with part of this. Even a contribution of $1,000 would make a real difference in how I'm managing the next 2 months. My father said, Margot, we're in the middle of a complicated financial period right now, and we've already committed to some existing obligations that are in motion. I'm really sorry, but I don't think we're in a position to help right now. Existing obligations already in motion. What does that mean? I asked. What obligations? He said they'd been helping to put things in place for Petra's move, and the scope of it had grown beyond what they initially anticipated. I said, Dad, I have cancer. I am asking for $1,000 to help cover my medical bills. The silence that followed was the kind that cannot be accurately reported, because the language doesn't have the granularity to hold it. It was long enough. It was specific enough in its quality that I knew before he spoke again what was coming. He said, Margot, you are so strong and so capable. We know you'll manage this. You always find a way. That's one of the things we've always admired most about you. I said, okay. I wrote it down. I wrote it down word for word, including the word admired, because that word was doing something very specific in that sentence and I wanted to be able to look at it later. I hung up. I sat on the floor of my kitchen with my back against the cabinets. Biscuit came and sat near my foot, not on my lap, just adjacent, which is what he does when something is wrong and he knows better than to crowd me. I looked at him for a while. Then I opened my laptop and added a new entry to the log. December 12th. Asked for $1,000 contribution toward medical bills. Father declined. Cited existing obligations already in motion. Related to Petra's move. Said I always find a way. And that's when I realized this hadn't been planned in a week. It had been building for months, possibly for years, in the quiet grammar of a family that had long ago distributed its children into roles, and had been maintaining those roles so consistently that no one noticed the logic of it anymore. Petra was the one who needed protection and investment. I was the one who found a way. I had been reading that sentence my whole life without recognizing that I was in it. January arrived cold and the light was the particular white of a winter that isn't particularly cold but has given up on warmth. Petra left for Florence on January 4th with 2 checked bags, a carry-on, and a new Canon EOS R5 mirrorless camera body with 2 additional lenses that my parents had purchased as a going-away gift. I know the specific model because my mother photographed the unboxing, including the receipt, which she didn't notice was visible in the background of one of the images, and sent it to our family group chat with the caption, Our girl is ready for Florence, followed by 3 heart emojis and a camera emoji. The Canon EOS R5 body retails for approximately $4,200 at standard pricing. The 2 lenses she'd chosen, a 24 to 105 mm and a 50 mm prime, visible in the unboxing photos, represent an additional $800 to $1,100 depending on configuration. I was in the infusion suite for my 5th cycle when that photo arrived. The bag was dripping. I had been awake since 4 in the morning because sleep the night before an infusion is difficult in the way that sleep before anything significant is difficult. The body knows something is coming even when the mind is trying to rest. I looked at the photo for a moment. Then I turned my phone face down on the armrest and watched the bag. I did not respond to the group chat. I didn't respond that afternoon or evening. My mother sent a follow-up message 2 hours later. "Margot, did you see? Doesn't she look so ready?" That night she sent another. "Hope treatment went okay today, thinking of you." I typed and deleted several responses. I landed, eventually, on "Safe travels to Petra." 3 words. That was all. My mother called that evening. She said she was a little worried I'd seemed distant lately. She hoped I was taking care of my mental health as well as my physical health. She said keeping your spirits up made a genuine difference in treatment outcomes. She'd read that, and she hoped I wasn't letting the difficulty of everything turn me inward, in a way that wasn't healthy. I said, "I know." I said it the way you say something when you have decided that the conversation is not a conversation but a performance your participation in will not improve. "I know," I said. "Thank you for calling." I wrote the date in my log, January 8th. What I did not tell my parents, what I did not tell anyone in my family at that point, was that I had begun making some quiet inquiries. Not because I had a plan yet. I didn't, or not a complete one. I had a researcher's instinct that had been activated, and a trained financier's response to a set of numbers that weren't balancing. When numbers don't balance, you look for the column that's missing. You look for the account that wasn't disclosed. You don't assume error before you've looked for omission. In mid-January, I called my maternal grandmother, Nana Ruth. She is 78 years old. She lives in Scottsdale. She is the kind of woman who volunteers at a literacy program on Thursday mornings, sends handwritten birthday cards that always arrive exactly on the right day, and has never in her life deployed a social lie when she thought the truth would serve better. She had been one of my consistent anchors through the whole of treatment, a card after every infusion cycle, a phone call every Sunday without exception, a pressed flower or a short copied poem inside every envelope as though warmth needed to be tangible to be real. I called her on a Saturday morning and asked carefully, framing it as concern for my parents rather than for myself, whether she knew anything about their financial situation, whether they were under any unusual pressure she was aware of. Nana Ruth was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of someone deciding something. Then she said, "Margot, honey, I'm going to tell you something because I think you need to know it. Your grandfather's trust distribution was processed in October. Your parents each received their share of the remaining estate. Each of them received $40,000 before taxes. I know this because I was the trustee and I processed the transfer myself." I sat very still. "Did they mention that to you?" she asked. "No," I said. "They didn't." "I didn't think so," she said. "I love your parents, Margot. I love them. But I have eyes." I thanked her. I told her I loved her. I stayed on the phone with her for another 20 minutes talking about her tomato seedlings that she was starting early this year, because she needed to talk about her tomato seedlings and I needed to sit somewhere comfortable while the thing she told me rearranged itself inside me. After we hung up, I opened my laptop. October 15th, trust distribution. From Granddad's estate processed. Parents each received approximately $40,000 before taxes. Combined inflow to family, approximately $80,000. My father had told me on December 12th, 8 weeks after that distribution, that they were in the middle of a complicated financial period and that existing obligations made it impossible to contribute $1,000 to my medical bills. I looked at those 2 facts sitting next to each other in my document for a long time. I want to be precise about the math, because precision is the only honest response I have to the particular shape of what happened to me. Over the following 3 weeks, I assembled a complete financial picture. I pulled together what I could verify from publicly available sources. I reviewed family email threads in which my parents had occasionally forwarded financial documents asking for my help with tax-related questions, a habit I had, in retrospect, Been enabling for years, always happy to assist, always the capable one. I cross-reference dates and amounts against the log I'd kept since September. The total documented expenditure on Petra's Florence year. Program tuition converted at the payment date exchange rate, $16,200. Combined first and last month's rent on her Florence apartment, $3,800. Transatlantic flight, $1,100 round trip. Italian language immersion program, $2,400 for the January intensive session. Monthly living allowance transferred to her Italian account, $1,200 per month from January through the end of April, totaling $4,800. Camera and lens package, approximately $5,300 based on models visible in the unboxing photos. Miscellaneous setup costs, household items, additional luggage, international travel insurance, fees for transferring money internationally, approximately $2,200. Confirmed total, approximately $35,800, expended in a period between November and April. Against that, the total contribution from my parents to my cancer treatment, $0. My total out-of-pocket medical expenses from diagnosis through the end of February, $6,120, all of which I paid myself, drawing on my savings and on the $6,000 that Nana Ruth had pressed into my hands in November when I mentioned the out-of-pocket trajectory. She had called me 2 days after our first honest conversation about my treatment costs, said she was sending something, told me not to argue with an old woman, and wired the money before I'd finished saying thank you. The contrast between what my parents gave Petra and what they gave me was not a feeling. It was not an impression. It was a ledger, and the ledger was unambiguous. February was also the month Dr. Reyes called me on a Thursday afternoon while I was standing in my kitchen making a pot of soup, because soup had become one of the few foods I could reliably taste and manage through the latter cycles. My phone rang. His name on the screen always produced a physical response that I never fully adjusted to. A slight tightening across my sternum, a recalibration of my breathing, a reorganization of whatever I'd been thinking into a temporary holding pattern. I set down the wooden spoon. I answered. "Margot," he said, and I could hear something in his voice before the words arranged themselves into meaning. Something with a different weight than the measured professional neutrality I had learned to interpret over 6 months of appointments and calls. "I'm looking at your latest PET scan images. What I'm seeing is what we were hoping to see," he said. "We're seeing a complete metabolic response in the primary site. The main lymph node chain has responded significantly. We still have cycles to complete and I want to keep monitoring carefully, but I am genuinely encouraged." More than encouraged. He used the word excellent at one point. He used the phrase responding well to protocol. He said he wanted to schedule the end of treatment scan to confirm, but that his clinical read of the interim images was the best reading he'd had in this case. I thanked him. I told him I understood. We talked for 12 minutes about the remaining treatment schedule and the monitoring plan for the 6 months following completion. Then I hung up and sat down on the kitchen floor, back against the lower cabinets, and cried for about 6 minutes. Not from fear. Not from the relief of escaping a worst case. It was something more complicated than relief. A kind of layered emotional release that included relief but also wound through it. A grief I hadn't let myself feel fully until that moment. Because the scan was good. And no one in my family had asked about it. No one had called the week before to say your scan is Thursday, let us know. No one had marked the date. No one had left a voicemail that morning saying thinking of you today. The terror of that scan had lived inside me for 3 weeks, and it had lived there entirely alone, because the people who were supposed to share the weight of that kind of terror with me had been operating on the assumption that I was managing. I cried for 6 minutes. Then I washed my face. I finished making the soup. I sat at my kitchen table with biscuit in my lap and ate half a bowl of it. And then I opened my laptop and began writing what I would eventually call simply the letter. I didn't send it for 6 weeks. I spent those 6 weeks completing the documentation, pulling together everything I needed into a single organized file, the dated log of conversations with dates and substance and exact language where I had it, the trust distribution timeline from Nana Ruth, the itemized Petra expenditure summary assembled from email records and public price verification, the complete record of my out-of-pocket medical expenses with copies of every explanation of benefits, every bill, every receipt, every appeal outcome. I kept the file on my desktop in a folder labeled Tax Documents 2023 because I have always processed difficulty with a certain dark pragmatism. I also had 2 sessions with a therapist during those 6 weeks, a woman named Dr. Okafor who specialized in family systems and medical trauma. I want to be clear that I was not looking for permission or validation. I was looking for a calibration check. When you have been living inside a painful situation for months, you lose some of your ability to assess whether your response to it is proportional or whether the pain has introduced distortions you can't see from the inside. Dr. Okafor said my read of the situation was accurate. She said my response, documentation, delay, deliberate preparation rather than reactive confrontation, was not only measured but represented a sophisticated understanding of how to protect my own experience from being rewritten. She said the thing I was grieving was not just the money or the practical abandonment during a medical crisis, but the collapse of a narrative I had believed about my family that was not, in fact, consistent with the evidence. "What do you want from sending this letter?" she asked. "I want them to understand what they did," I said. "I want it to be on the record in a way that can't be revised later. I want the version of the story where I'm the capable one who was fine to stop being the only available version. And after that?" I sat with the question. "I want to be free of the obligation to pretend." She nodded. "That's an honest answer. That's worth working toward." The letter was 6 pages, single-spaced, in the register I use when I am presenting findings in a professional context, clear, factual, and without rhetorical flourish. I began with a brief statement of purpose. I was writing because I needed them to understand what the past 8 months had looked like from where I was sitting, and I was writing it rather than saying it because I had spent my life saying things to them that needed to be heard differently. I moved into the chronology. September 29th, first request for help, first deferral. The October cost summary. The November phone call about Florence and the family phrase. The December 12th phone call, transcribed as precisely as I could render it, including my father's exact language about existing obligations. Then the trust distribution, Nana Ruth's confirmation, the date of the transfer, the amounts received by each parent. Then the Petra expenditure summary, line by line with amounts and dates. Then my own medical expense record, line by line with amounts and dates. I did not use the word selfish. I did not use the word unfair. I did not write a sentence that could be categorized as an emotional appeal or an accusation in the conventional sense. I presented the information the way a forensic accountant presents findings. Here are the dates, here are the numbers, here is what the comparison shows. Near the end I wrote, "I am not writing this to demand money. I am writing this because I need you to understand what this year looked like from where I was sitting, alone in an infusion suite watching my phone for a message that didn't come, while the record I've now assembled shows a different set of priorities was operating in our family. I needed you to choose me. You didn't. I needed the phrase you've said my entire life. We do what we have to do for the ones who need it most. To include me in it. It didn't. I want you to sit with what that means. Asterisk. I closed with. Asterisk. I am going to be fine. My most recent scan shows strong treatment response, and I expect to complete my protocol on schedule. I thought you should know that since neither of you asked. I will be in touch when I'm ready. Until then, please give me space. Asterisk. I printed 3 copies on a Tuesday evening. I mailed one to each of my parents separately, in separate envelopes addressed to them individually, because I wanted each of them to understand this was a personal accounting rather than a family announcement. The 3rd copy I mailed to Nana Ruth with a short note that said, "You earned the right to know exactly what I said." My mother called 4 times in the first hour after she received the letter. I didn't answer. She left a voicemail that I listened to twice and then saved. It began, "Margot, I don't know what's come over you. This isn't like you at all. I think the treatment has been harder than you're letting on and I just want to." I stopped listening there. I saved the voicemail. Folder. Same as everything else. My father called twice that same evening. He left a voicemail in which he said he was blindsided and that I was mischaracterizing things significantly. He said the trust money had been earmarked for long-term planning and was not as liquid as I was implying. He did not explain how funds that were not liquid had simultaneously funded an 8-month photography program in Florence, for months of living expenses, and a $4,000 camera package. That gap between assertion and explanation was its own kind of data point. My sister called from Florence at what must have been midnight in Italy, and her voice when I answered had a quality I hadn't heard from her in years, stripped of the effortful lightness she often uses around me, just raw distress. She said she hadn't known. She said my parents hadn't told her I'd asked for help, hadn't told her I'd been struggling with the out-of-pocket costs, hadn't given her any information that would have let her see what the full picture was. She said she would never have accepted their help knowing what the full picture was. I believed her. I want to be clear about that because it matters to the moral shape of this story. Petra is not a schemer. She did not participate in a conspiracy to take resources from me during a cancer diagnosis. She received what was offered without asking where it came from, which is the behavior of someone who has been given to so consistently that the question of provenance has never felt necessary. That is not malice. It is a kind of profound, cultivated unawareness that the family structure had produced in her over 31 years. I can believe in her innocence completely and still grieve the situation. Those two things are not in conflict. I'm sorry, she said. Margot, I am so sorry. I know, I said. I believe you. What can I do? Right now? Nothing, I said. I need some space from all of this, including for a little while from you. Not because you're the cause of it, but because I need to be somewhere quiet where I'm not managing anyone's feelings about what happened, including yours. She said she understood. I'm not sure she fully did. But she honored it, which was the thing I needed most. My parents each sent a handwritten letter in response, which I noted because they rarely handwrite anything. The handwriting was itself a signal, a performance of sincerity that felt calibrated. My mother's letter said she was devastated, that she loved me more than she could articulate, that she had made mistakes she was ashamed of, and that she hoped I could find it in my heart to let her try to be better. She did not dispute any of the figures. She did not offer an alternative narrative. The absence of argument was, in its way, its own kind of confirmation. My father's letter was longer and more structurally complex. He said he understood now, in hindsight, that the timing had been terrible. He said they had perhaps not fully appreciated the financial pressure I was under. He said that in their minds they had believed, based on what I'd communicated, that I had the situation largely in hand. I had communicated explicitly and on December 12th that I needed help with the remaining out-of-pocket costs and that I was going to have to liquidate emergency savings to cover them. He had declined and cited existing obligations. The claim that they believed I had things largely in hand was not consistent with what I had told them. That was not a misremembering. That was a revision. I wrote it in my log where it joined all the other entries. A family meeting was proposed in April. My mother called one afternoon, using the voice she uses when she is already 4 steps into an emotional negotiation she hasn't announced out loud, and said she thought it might help for all of us to sit together with a neutral third party and talk through everything in a safe environment. I said I would think about it. What I thought over the 3 days I took before responding was a family meeting run on my parents' terms, in a space where their discomfort sets the agenda. We'll produce a conversation designed to move things back toward a version of the story that is more comfortable for everyone. My mother is a gifted contextualizer. She can introduce 15 adjacent facts that don't change the central fact, but create enough atmospheric complexity around it that the central fact begins to seem less significant. My father can transform a deliberate choice into an understandable oversight in a way that sounds almost persuasive until you look at the dates. I had the dates. I wrote back with 3 conditions. The mediator would be a licensed family therapist selected by me from a list of accredited professionals. No portion of the meeting would be dedicated to contesting the accuracy of the documented record I had presented, and I would attend when I was ready, not according to a timeline set by their discomfort with the current state of things. My mother replied that these conditions seemed very formal. I wrote back yes. The meeting happened on a Saturday in late May in a therapist's office. Dr. Marcia Fuentes, 17 years of family systems practice, $240 per hour. I sat across from my parents at a round table designed to prevent the geometry of opposition. I had brought nothing with me. I had the information in my head, where it had been living for months, and I didn't need paper to access it. My parents cried. My mother more than once, freely, in the way she has always been more comfortable with grief than with accountability. My father's version of crying is a particular tightening around the eyes and a compression of the mouth that I have seen only twice in my life before that afternoon, and I want to note that I believe it was genuine. I believe they felt real pain sitting in that room. I believe they experienced the situation as loss, as rupture, as a painful confrontation with something they would have preferred to leave unexamined. I sat with that belief and didn't let it do the work of forgiveness, because believing someone feels pain about what they did is not the same thing as believing the original act was unconscious or unpatterned or unlikely to recur without structural change. My father said he understood now what it must have felt like to ask for help and be turned away. I said, "What changed between December and now?" "The facts are the same. The numbers are the same. The situation hasn't changed. What made you understand now what you didn't understand on December 12th? He was quiet for what felt like a long time but was probably 20 seconds. Then he said, "I read the letter. The letter has the same information I gave you on December 12th over the phone." I said, "The amounts are identical. The timeline is identical. The only thing that changed is that it was written down." He didn't argue with that. He nodded slowly and didn't offer a counter-reading. That was the moment I had been working toward for 7 months. Not an explosion, not a collapse, not someone's public dignity in ruins. Just a room in which the truth was sitting in its chair and could not be asked to leave, and where the people who had needed not to see it were no longer able to arrange the furniture such that it was out of view. I finished my final infusion cycle on June 3rd. Dr. Reyes reviewed my post-treatment PET scan on June 19th. I was sitting on my back porch when my phone rang. Biscuit was in my lap. Biscuit, who had been the most consistent presence through the entire 9 months, who had slept on the foot of my bed every single night without exception as though he had decided this was a job and he was not a cat who walked away from his obligations. Dr. Reyes said the words I had been constructing mental scaffolding around since October. Complete remission. I thanked him. I told him I understood the monitoring schedule going forward, that I'd have scans at 3-month intervals for the first year and then 6-month intervals after that, and that I'd see him at the first follow-up in September. He said he was proud of how I'd come through it. He said those words specifically, "Proud of how you came through it." I thanked him again. We hung up. I sat on the porch for a long time afterward. The neighbor's dog was barking at something 3 houses away. A plane crossed high overhead in a straight white line. Biscuit purred with the focused, contractual purring of a cat who knows the work isn't finished until you're actually okay. I didn't call my parents first. I called Nana Ruth. She wept the way she weeps, quietly with occasional intakes of breath that sound like someone stepping into cold water. She said, "I knew it. I knew it was going to be all right. I knew it from the first time I talked to you after the diagnosis. You had that sound in your voice, that sound like a person who has decided." I was terrified. I told her. "I know," she said. "You sounded terrified too. But terrified and decided at the same time. That's the part that told me." We stayed on the phone for 40 minutes. She told me about a friend of hers who'd had a similar diagnosis 20 years earlier and was still gardening, still traveling, still calling Nana Ruth on birthdays. She told me she was proud of me. She told me she loved me in the way she says it, completely without qualification, without any implied debt. I told her about the letter, which she already knew. I told her about the family meeting. I told her I was trying to figure out what came next relationally, now that the most acute part of everything was behind me. She said, "What do you want to come next?" "Something more honest," I said. "I don't need everything to be fixed. I just need to stop pretending things are what they aren't." "That's not asking for too much," she said. "That's asking for the minimum." Here is what I know now that I couldn't have organized into sentences in September, sitting alone in the infusion suite while the bag dripped and my phone stayed dark. Some families have a child who exists to need things, and a child who exists to manage things. The child who needs things is labeled, lovingly, as someone who requires investment, someone sensitive, someone still finding their footing, someone in whom potential is always visible, and always slightly unrealized and therefore always requiring another round of support. The child who manages things is labeled also lovingly as strong, capable, the one who always finds a way. The child who manages has learned from very early in her life that the exchange rate for belonging in this family is competence. She learned it not from any explicit instruction but from the pattern of response, from the ways in which expressions of need were met with slightly less warmth than expressions of capability, from the way her self-sufficiency was celebrated in a register that made it clear she was valued for what she did not need rather than for what she was. She grew up understanding that asking for help was a kind of tax she was not entitled to levy, because her entire role in the family ecology was to be the one who didn't need to. And so when she got sick, she asked carefully. She asked without drama. She asked in the manner of someone presenting financial data, because she'd learned that was the only register in which she'd be heard. And when she was declined twice, 3 times in language that praised her very capability as the justification for the refusal, she had no precedent, no practiced response, no script for the experience of being told she would find a way while her sister's photography equipment was being gift-wrapped in the next room. That is not a family villain story. That is a family structure story. The distinction matters because family structure stories are harder to resolve, and because they don't end when the crisis does. They continue in the ordinary, peacetime moments when no one is in an infusion suite and everyone is being pleasant at dinner. And the question is whether you can rebuild the relationship on more honest foundations than the ones that broke under pressure. I don't know yet fully whether my family can do that. I think we are trying. I think the family meeting was a real effort, not a performance, or not only a performance. I think my father's November birthday call, in which he said he was proud of me not because I was strong but just because I was me, was a genuine attempt to say something different from what he'd been saying, and I received it as such. But I also know that the structure produces outcomes independent of anyone's intentions, that the pattern doesn't stop simply because it was named, and that my job now is not to rescue the relationship by absorbing the cost of its previous damage, but to engage with it honestly on terms I set, in the amount I can manage without betraying the version of myself I rebuilt in that infusion suite on a Tuesday in October when I finally stopped waiting. With Petra, the conversation has been different and in some ways more difficult because she and I are not in the same relationship as my parents and I, and the accounting between us is less about what she did and more about what we'd both been inside of without fully recognizing it. She came home from Florence in September. We had dinner in October, just us at a small Italian place she chose, and I decided it was either an unconscious gesture or a gentle joke and let it be whichever it was. We ordered pasta and a shared dessert and stayed for 2.5 hours. She told me she'd been thinking about the economics of her whole adult life, about how consistently and completely she'd been supported, and about how she'd never thought to question whether that support was coming from a finite pool that had other claims on it. I never asked where the money came from, she said. I trusted that if they were offering it, it was available. I know, I said. That's the part one don't blame you for. But I should have asked, she said. Yes, I said. You should have. We both should have been asking more questions about what was happening in our family for a very long time. She said, what do we do now? We be honest with each other, I said. We stop being in the version of each other that the family trained us to be. You don't need to perform how okay everything is. I don't need to perform how fine I am. We can just talk like people who share a history and are trying to figure out what to do with it. She looked at me for a moment. That would be new, she said. Yes, I said. It would. We are talking. We are using honest sentences. I consider this a meaningful beginning. My relationship with my parents now is careful and deliberate, which is different from cold. We see each other. We speak on the phone. The family meeting led to a second session, which led to a series of conversations over the following months that have moved the relationship toward something I would describe as more genuinely visible, less cushioned by the habitual performances we'd all been maintaining, less organized around the pretense that everything was equally distributed and everyone was equally considered. My parents have not fully, in any single conversation, sat with the whole of what they did. I don't expect they ever will, completely, not because they are incapable of accountability but because the human capacity for fully integrating the worst of what you've done to someone you love has natural limits. What they have done is stop arguing that it was different from what it was, and that is not nothing. In a family that had spent years maintaining a particular story about itself, stopping the argument is a form of admission. I asked my mother once directly what she had been thinking when I called on December 12th and asked for $1,000. She was quiet for a long time. I think I believed you would be okay, she said finally. You have always been okay. You have always managed. And Petra was at such a fragile point. She'd been struggling for so long to find something that felt like hers. And you've always been so certain, so established. What would it have taken, I said, for me to seem like I was not okay? She thought about it. She didn't answer. I didn't press her because I don't think she knows. I don't think she has ever developed the specific lens that would let her see me as someone with a threshold, because my entire identity in this family was built on the performance of not having one. That's not her failure alone. It was a system, and I participated in it too for decades because the alternative being the needy one, the difficult one, the one who cost something, had always seemed worse than the accumulated expense of being the capable one. It wasn't. I understand that now. The accumulated expense of being the capable one includes sitting alone in an infusion suite on a Tuesday in October with a dark phone screen, because the people who should have been calling were busy believing you were fine. It's been almost 2 years since that October Tuesday. I am in remission. My last scan 5 months ago showed no evidence of recurrence. Dr. Reyes used the word excellent twice in that appointment, and I wrote it in my calendar and took myself out to a proper dinner at a restaurant with a menu that listed things in both English and Italian, in a small act of personal symbolism that I found more meaningful than I expected. Biscuit is asleep on the radiator behind me as I write this. He has aged very slightly since the diagnosis, a new white patch near his left ear that appeared sometime in the spring, and I find it genuinely moving that he grew older alongside me through the thing that tried to shorten my story. There is something about the loyalty of a creature who stays not because he understands what you're going through but simply because you are his person and he goes where you are. My father called on my birthday this year, which he has not reliably done in more years than I can easily count without consulting my calendar. He called without being prompted, without any other agenda attached to the call, and he talked for 20 minutes about my work, about a book he'd been reading, about a ridiculous situation at his golf club that he told badly and we both laughed at anyway. At the end, before he said goodbye, he paused and said, "I hope you know I'm proud of you. Not because of how you handled things, just because you're you." I didn't cry on the phone. I thanked him. I said I loved him. We hung up. Then I sat at my kitchen table for a while, biscuit in my lap, and let myself feel what that call was. Incomplete atonement, yes, and arrived years late, and nowhere near sufficient on its own. But also real. Also genuinely meant. Also the beginning of a different vocabulary between us, one that doesn't require me to be the capable one in order to be loved, and one that doesn't require him to be a villain in order for the truth of what happened to be acknowledged. I wrote it in my log. Birthday. He called. He said, "Just because you're you." I have been keeping the log for 2 years. It holds the full shape of this story, the receipts and the dates and the amounts and the silences and the phone calls and the family phrases and the scan results and the one afternoon in late September when Nana Ruth told me about the trust distribution and the whole architecture of what had happened quietly rearranged itself into something I could finally see clearly. I keep it not as a weapon. I keep it as a record of my own experience, which no one can revise and no one can take from me, and which includes the difficult parts and the healing parts and the parts that are still unresolved and the parts that, against reasonable odds, turned out to be more possible than I expected. If you've made it here, I want to say something to you directly without any pretense of what this is or isn't. If you are the capable one in your family, the one who manages, who is praised for strength, who is assumed to find a way, I want you to hear this carefully. Your calm is not evidence that you don't need things. Your capability is not consent to be left alone with the cost. The absence of drama is not the same as the absence of damage. The people who love you most may have sorted you, without meaning to, into a category that makes your needs invisible. That sorting is not a verdict on your worth. It is a habit of perception that can be interrupted by documentation, by honesty, by the refusal to keep participating in the narrative that costs you the most. Document your experience. Trust what you observe. When someone tells you they can't help you because of existing obligations, and then the records show a different story, you are not obligated to accept the revised version. You are allowed to have seen what you saw, felt what you felt, and said so carefully, precisely, with the full weight of the evidence behind you. The most devastating thing you can do to a story built on your silence is refuse to be silent. Not with screaming. Not with scenes. Not with anything that can be reframed as instability or oversensitivity. With dates. With amounts. With the exact words that were said and the exact conditions under which they were said, and a clear-eyed account of what the comparison between those words and the financial record actually shows. That is where dignity lives. That is where I found it on a Tuesday in October in an infusion suite, with Biscuit waiting at home and a dark phone screen on the armrest and a new document open on my laptop, and the quiet decision to start writing down everything I knew. It was the best decision I made that year. Possibly the best decision I've made in my life.